Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I am your host, Dr. Chulanee Attanayake, Research Fellow at the Institute. So, since the idea of Indo-Pacific has become a point of reference for Australian government to define the country's foreign and security policy interest, global developments such as the Quad grouping, growing competition between India, China, and the recently formed AUKUS reflect the pace of geopolitical change in the Indo-Pacific and the centrality of the region to Australia for security and trade purposes. To discuss these aspects and more, I am joined by Dr. Bec Strating, Director of Trobe Asia and an Associate Professor in Politics and International Relations in the Department of Politics, Media and Philosophy. Welcome to South Asia Chat, Dr. Strating.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So let's begin with the most discussed strategic document recently. So Australia's Indian Ocean strategy has evolved significantly in the recent years, and this is reflected in the 2020 Defence Strategic Update as well. This document identifies the Northeast Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific as three priorities for Australia and as its priority immediate regions. How this impact Australia's strategic outlook, and how do you think this will impact its approach to South Asia?
Well, it's an interesting question because the 2020 Defence Strategic Update, as you mentioned, prioritises the immediate region around Australia in terms of defence, but it needs to be kind of placed within Australia's broader Indo-Pacific concept, which is a bit broader than that sort of characterisation of the immediate region. And part of the driving or part of it, the central sort of component of Australia's Indo-Pacific concept as it's emerged over the last decade or so is a greater focus on the Indian Ocean. You know, previously Australia had really paid a lot of attention to the Pacific, and this was an attempt to kind of rebalance how we think about our strategic geography. And so in the Indian Ocean, maritime security cooperation is becoming increasingly important. And there's a good reason for that. I mean, if we think about the length of Western Australia's coastline, most of which faces out into the Indian Ocean, its coastline is nearly 13,000 kilometres, and it's 20,000 kilometres if you include its offshore territories, which is just a remarkable kind of length of coastline. So it's there's no sort of great mystery as to why the Indian Ocean should be considered important to Australia's security. And the Indian Ocean is also home to lucrative offshore hydrocarbon reserves. There are important ports that are situated along that coastline. So there are good reasons for Australia to be interested in the Indian Ocean. So that's part of the reason why Australia has adopted this Indo-Pacific concept. And the other important component is that it's really wanting to grow bilateral ties with India. And as I mentioned, you know, those of us who are situated on the east coast of Australia have tended to look up to the north and to the east towards the Asia Pacific. But now there is this real concerted effort to increase links with India. The partnership was elevated to a comprehensive strategic partnership in 2020. They're both members of the Quad. There's a sort of economic strategy that India's been pushing. In fact, there's even been an interim free trade agreement. The Australia-India Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement was announced this year. And while it probably doesn't go as far as what various groups would like, it's still a sign that the two countries are really trying to cooperate in the economic space. Australia's been accepted into Malabar exercises, which for a number of years we were in Australia thinking we might not be invited. And so that's a real sign of maritime security cooperation between Australia and India. And there's been various initiatives. Only a couple of weeks ago, it was announced that the Australian government's going to spend $28 million on a new centre for Australia-India relations. So there's a real push, I think, certainly from Australia's perspective, in deepening ties with India. And that is very much a part of Australia's Indo Pacific concept and how it views its strategic neighbourhood. And of course, it's not just about relations with India. I mean, my argument is that it's mostly about relations with India. I think that's really what Australia is concerned about. But also wrapped up in this is increasing collaboration with other Indian Ocean partners. There's been, a $36.5 million package announced for over 5 years to improve cooperation in maritime shipping and disaster resilience and information sharing in the Northeast Indian Ocean. And Bangladesh is a key focus in that particular initiative. There's a new High Commission being announced in the Maldives. And of course, Australia relates with Indian Ocean states through various regional forums, the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, IORA, the Indian Ocean Rim Association. So there is this effort, I think, to engage more with South Asia states from Australia's side. I think that from my perspective, more investment really needs to be made in areas like people-to-people links, education, and Australia's own understanding of South Asia, particularly in the tertiary sector.
Thank you for that very comprehensive overview. Now, since you already mentioned about the growing ties between Australia and India in the backdrop of Quad, let me ask a very sort of like something related to the region. What is Australia's view on the developing regional dynamics such as India China rivalry, and how much of its engagement are guided by its approach of keeping a check on China's rise?
Yeah, I might start by really considering views of China within Australia, because that's part of addressing that question about Australia and India is really linked to how Australia views China and its rise and what it means for the region. And since about 2017, so after around the last 5 years or so, Australia's really dropped its pragmatic approach to China. And so the pragmatic foreign policy approach was this idea that Australia could have its cake and eat it too when it came to relations with great powers, the US and China in particular. It could have its security relationship alliance with the United States, but it could also strengthen its economic ties with China, and that there wouldn't be substantial consequences or clashes between these security and economic relationships. And what we've seen over the last 5 years is that has come to a head, that actually there is a tension between these security and economic relationships, and that you can't necessarily have your cake and eat it too, and that Australia has increasingly sought to choose its alliance with the United States. So there was, we used to talk about it in terms of, oh, Australia doesn't need to choose. Well, it's chosen. Like let's put it that way. And we're in the middle of an election campaign, a federal election campaign in Australia as we're having this conversation, and it's focused on security and defence policy issues, which is great. It's positive in the sense that citizens are discussing, are thinking about issues that have traditionally been thought of as being bipartisan, and not really always canvassed in federal elections. But there's a sense in which the China threat narratives have become weaponized, and we're we've been focusing a lot, for example, on the Solomon Islands and China Security Pact. And, there's been concerns about what that means for Australia's own security position, and a lot of breathless reporting about, the potential for Chinese military bases and so on. But this has been a significant issue. And, extraordinarily, a couple of months ago, Australia's head of ASIO, which is the Australia Security Intelligence Organisation, actually rebuked the government for accusing members of the opposition Labor Party of being under the thumb of the Chinese Communist Party, or being sort of, dictated to by the CCP, and said that such weaponized narratives don't actually make their role in the intelligence community any easier, which is really interesting. But the point I'm trying to make here is that Australia's view on developing regional dynamics are really, really shaped by a rising China and what that means for the region. So not just in terms of the India-China rivalry, but particularly in terms of strategic competition between the US and China, and in areas like the Pacific, where Australia is seen as somewhat of a proxy for the United States. So if we look at the relationship with India as an example, there's efforts to downplay rising China as a driving feature of growing relations between Australia and India, to kind of focus on elements such as, growing mutual understanding and trust, or the Indian diaspora in Australia. But really, I think strategic competition is the most significant factor in Australia-India relations. And, the I don't. There's also, a narrative out there that Australia and India are both democracies, and that's also like a shared value, or a shared political system that we share. But that really just provides cover for a much more interest-based approach, which is that both states are uncomfortable with rising China and what it means for regional order. So I'll leave it there.
I really like your cake analogy about the relationship.
I love cake. So
So you mentioned about the ongoing debate about the Pacific Island states and Australia. So let me sort of like ask something related to that. Now, Australia's relations with various Pacific Island states have been a crucial component for its foreign policy for a long period of time, as you already explained. Now, with the growing importance of the Indian Ocean region in recent times, with several countries in the West releasing their Indo Pacific strategies, do you see a similar deepening of relations with island states in the Indian Ocean as well? And how does Australia's approach to the small island states in the Indian Ocean within its larger Indo Pacific strategy would look like?
it's such a good question, and I really wish I knew, because actually part of what I see about Australia's approach to the Indo-Pacific is actually it still thinks about that region in terms of sub-regions, or maritime domains. So, we've got a particular approach in the Pacific, which still gets called really kind of paternalistically our neighbourhood, or we keep talking about the Pacific family. There's some quite problematic kind of attitudes out there around Australia's relationship with the Pacific. But in any case, we see it as being really important strategically, to our own sense of security. And then we see, Southeast Asia as also being quite significant, and the Indian Ocean still probably lags behind those two particular areas, with the exception of India, the growing bilateral relations with India, and the Quad. It's still not clear to me that the small island states of the Indian Ocean are going to be prioritised in the same way way that the small island states of the Pacific Ocean will be. And that is, I think, part of the issue with Australia's Indo-Pacific approach is that it's not necessarily coherent. It's not necessarily looking at these maritime domains in the same ways, and it's a bit patchy, if you like. So in the Pacific, there's a lot going on in Australia's relationship with Pacific Island countries. There's the Pacific Step Up, which started, around 2018, I think, where you see this real investment, particularly in security areas, but also in infrastructure from Australia, because they recognised that there was a gap and that China was filling that gap. So it was driven again by concerns about rising China in the region. It's got the Pacific Maritime Security Program, which is, really quite an important part of Australia's maritime security strategy more generally. We've got 21 Guardian class patrol boats being gifted to Pacific Island states. Training is included. This is part of helping, or I guess assisting these Pacific Island states to manage and monitor these huge exclusive economic zones. You've got similar issues in the Indian Ocean, the huge maritime space that is, it might be subject to blue crimes like IUU fishing or transnational drug smuggling, particularly thinking about climate change and the effects that has on maritime environments. So, Pacific Maritime Security Program, sort of Australia's effort to support maritime security sovereignty, in a sense, the ability of Pacific Island states to try to shore up the security of their maritime jurisdictions. I mean, that's something that could potentially be spread across other regions. Although, India, I think, views the Indian Ocean in the same way that Australia views Pacific Ocean. So that's a sort of coordinated activities, I guess, among Quad states that really need to be mapped out. But the biggest problem for Australia in its relationship with Pacific Island states is not acting on climate change. We've really lagged. We're pretty much an international pariah on climate change action, and it's a serious impediment with relations with Pacific Island states. There is a divergent threat perception for a lot of Pacific Island leaders. Their concern isn't with what China's doing. Their concern is that is that climate change presents an existential security threat that is immediate, like that is not just something that's far away into the future, but is actually affecting them now, and that needs to be dealt with. Rising sea levels, potential to make particularly low-lying atolls uninhabitable, creating issues for people who are living on that land. But there's also, consequences for maritime boundaries and resource entitlements. And these sorts of issues are also important issues in the Indian Ocean and for Indian Ocean states. We see Maldives, for example, 80% could become uninhabitable by 2050 because of if current rates of global warming keep up. So, there's these efforts in that state to try and, create reinforcements and to prevent erosion due to rising sea levels. And Pacific Island states are taking approaches like trying to fix maritime boundaries within international law. And this has been an important component of small state island diplomacy. So there are issues in the Pacific Island states that are kind of similar to what's going on in the Indian Ocean, particularly around climate change. And that is a real area that if Australia wants to engage with small island states, it needs to fix its domestic policy. And it really needs to start setting genuine targets and working towards them.
I totally agree with how the problems with regard to special climate change are quite similar in both Pacific Islands and Indian Ocean Islands, and also that it would help for Australia to have a coherent policy with regard to all the island states if you really sort of study their concerns and issues and their strategic priorities. So, this brings me to my last question. So, moving forward, what do you make for the future of Australia South Asia relationship, especially with respect to small island states and also with respect to potential challenges you foresee and how these challenges can be overcome?
Well, I think there's three areas, and some of this I've kind of already mapped out in my previous responses. But the first challenge is divergent attitudes to strategic competition, to China, and to the role that China plays in the region. I mean, Australia has a particular view on the type of security threat that China poses to its own national security, but also to I guess what would say a regional balance of power. That is, and that perspective is not necessarily shared. By other regional states. And it will have a difficult time trying to impose its will on regional states just by just by wanting states to counter China is not necessarily going to happen. So I think Australia would do well in investing a lot more in diplomacy and development, other arms of statecraft, dealing with climate change, for example, dealing with things like humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and really focusing on some of the issues that regional states are concerned with, rather than trying to push them into understanding China in the same way that Australia or Australia's strategic elite anyway, views China. So I think divergent attitudes to strategic competition is the first challenge. The second is policies on climate change. As I mentioned, this is a particular weakness for Australia. And I think that if it wants more regional credibility, if it wants to be a regional leader, and I think it does, then it needs to really start changing its domestic policy settings in regards to grappling with carbon emissions. And there's no reason why we shouldn't. I mean, we're very lucky in terms of, sun and wind and surf. So there's no reason why Australia couldn't be doing a lot more in terms of developing green economies. But there's these internal political problems that have made it very difficult for leaders in Australia to really move substantively on addressing climate change. But that continues to have an impact on our credibility in the region. And the next challenge is perceptions on the so-called rules-based order. I mean, when Australia, in my view, when Australia talks about the rules-based order, it's really talking about a US-led order. And even states like US and Australia, which purport to support a rules-based order, don't always, if it doesn't suit its interests, their interests. So I think that there is some different attitudes towards what rules matter and how to create an inclusive rules-based order in the region. And Australia and other states that it partners with in the region really need to be careful not to exclude states by focusing too much on minilaterals like Quad or like AUKUS, because these can be seen as excluding regional states, particularly I think the diplomacy around AUKUS demonstrated that, where this new security pact was announced, and it seemed like, from the Australian view, very little attention was paid to how other states in the region might respond to this, and even India. A member of the Quad state, initially the response from government officials was quite sort of reserved, and within, I was reading some reports. One was written by Arbajit Singh in Lowy Interpreter that said that even in New Delhi, among kind of strategic elites, there's a difference of opinion about whether AUKUS is a net benefit or or a security problem for India. So I think these sort of three areas are probably the most important in my view. There are lots of other challenges, economic challenges in terms of economic or differences in how states see an economic rules based order. Might be another one, but I think really it's about, for Australia, and thinking about it during this period of being in a federal election, and about to go off and vote, we really need policies that are going to engage us in the region. And they can't just be policies that are tied to whatever China's doing or to our, desperate support for a US-led regional order. They really need to be about deepening our relationships with states on their terms, not outside of the great powers, but because we view that as being an important part of being a member of this Indo-Pacific community.
Thank you, Dr. Strating, for that very insightful discussion. I really enjoyed it. I'm sure our listeners also will learn a lot about Australia's Indo Pacific strategy. Now, with that, we have come to an end of today's episode. You were listening to South Asia Chart. To learn more about our work, visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates on social media. We are on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram.